So I have here a book full of Mormon Redress petitions. These are petitions the Latter-day Saints in the 1800s wrote to the federal government to ask for redress, for help, for being kicked out of Missouri by mobs. I have some ancestors in here, and there's lots of losses. They're sad things to read. It's people saying, "Hey, I lost my land, I lost my family, my family was injured, and we lost health, we lost livestock, we lost wagons, we lost guns, we lost all kinds of stuff." And they sent these petitions to the federal government, and they went unanswered, right? In fact, several of the petitions weren't even opened when the researcher Clark Johnson came across them. They weren't even, the federal government had never read them, never read lots of these petitions. So the question comes, why did the Latter-day Saints project in Missouri fail? Why did people get kicked out? Why, it was supposed to be their promised land, it was supposed to be their city of Zion. And why did it fail? The explanation in the scriptures is that the people weren't faithful, that the saints weren't willing to set aside their jealousies and set aside their covetousness, and weren't willing to live a united order, and they weren't willing to take care of the poor among them, and so they failed, and based on their sins they failed. And I believe that I believe that, but I also believe that God knew there was, I guess, some good in it failing, and that God knew that it was going to fail beforehand. I don't think that this frustrated God's plan, because without Missouri, I don't think that there would have been the ability for the saints to go to Utah. And without Utah, I think that the church would have fallen apart a few decades later in the Civil War of the United States. So my thinking on this is that Missouri, one, gave the saints a motivation to leave the United States. They realized that the government was not gonna help them, that they were going to be hated, that they were going to be persecuted. And so when a similar thing happens in Illinois, in Nauvoo, I think that they're much more willing to go out into the desert, into the wilderness. So I think that they're much more prepared, both emotionally, and they have the skills that they need and better skills to cross the plains. And so I think that if they didn't have that experience in Missouri, I don't think that the immigration to Utah would have worked. The exodus to Utah would have worked. And if they were not in Utah, I think that when the Civil War erupts about 30 years later, or less than 30 years later, 20 or so years later, that the saints would have fallen apart. The Civil War caused a lot of upheaval, a lot of devastation. I think that the church, I don't know if a new church would have been able to survive a Civil War, especially if with the saints being kind of an outsider community inside of a major community. I don't think that they would have been trusted. I think that the government would have wanted them to pick sides, which they probably would have. And since lots of them were from the north, they would have tried to been on the north, but they would have been an easy target for Southern armies. So, yeah, I think that they would have gotten torn apart in the Civil War. And so I think that in a way, the Missouri failure of the saints to establish Zion resulted in the church being preserved long-term through the Civil War.